Hi, and welcome to this presentation of the newest update to MapUs. A bit of background about how this update came about is in response to some different demands that we've had from partners over the last year or so. We always try to adapt our tool to match the reality of the partners that we're working with. And in this case, a lot of those demands were regarding functionalities to the report module and also giving some more tools on how to work more meaningfully with competence grouping. So those are the two main changes that have been made to the platform in this new update. The layout of the general platform hasn't changed that much. The layout of the admin menu has been tweaked a little bit, and that tweaking is also reflected on the different subsites, but it doesn't really change the functionality, except for the two places where we've implemented significant changes. And those two places are, as I mentioned, in the reporting module and in the competence editor. And I'll start by walking through the changes to the competence editor. If we click into it, you'll see that instead of just one long list of competences like it was before, they're now grouped into categories. And the thought behind this is that from an admin perspective, it makes it a bit more easier to differentiate between your different groups. Most of our partners work in one way or another with competences where you have some overarching categories and some primary competences under those overarching categories represented in a wheel or something similar. And that design is now also reflected in the backend. The way that you can use this as well is making the results more intuitive to read. If I just show you on the front page here, before on a result page, you would just have the wheel and then the four categories listed on the side here. And they wouldn't have a title or description that let the reader directly know what it was all about and what the connection was, but you now have the opportunity to make that connection really explicit and direct, so it's super intuitive for the user to read their results. And the way you do that in concrete terms is by clicking into your group. Just click the header. You have the opportunity to give the group a name and to give the group a definition. Another change that has now been made to the competence manager is the way that you organize your competences in terms of what is shown in results and what is not. The way it works now is that you select the group of competences which are your primary ones, which are the ones that would be in the wheel. In this case, we have the digital competences, and they've been set to be level 3. You decide the numbering. There's no set model for this. But if I've selected those to be level 3, that means that any competence group I put above level 3, for example level 2, will be included on the result page on the side of the wheel. Conversely, on the other side, anything that I put below level 3 will not be shown in the results, but will be available to you when you're doing your reporting. So this is really useful for your learning domains, for example, or personas, or any other filters, competence filters you may have created that you don't necessarily want to show in the results, but want to be able to draw on in reporting. You can then also give them a name and a description, so it's easier for you to navigate between them in the backend. So that wraps up sort of the change that has been made to the competence editor. Moving on to the big change, the reporting module. Before, we had two reporting tabs. We had one for advanced reports, which were for baseline reporting, and we had one for evaluation reports, which was benchmarking. And now we've gathered both of them in the same tab, so you can create both types of reports from the same place and with a lot of new features. When you enter the advanced report site, you'll recognize a lot of the elements. They've just been placed differently. We have a report link up here at the top. We have the section where you select your components in the report. the analysis and visualizations you want to include, as well as separate pages on competences and questions that might be relevant to you. We've introduced a few new analysis options that I'll walk through with you with an example in a bit. And down here in the Select Dataset section, you select what respondents you want to do your reporting on. To the right, you have your report preview that we've introduced. And what this enables you to do is make changes in your report and see how it looks in the presentation in real time. And if this is a bit too small for you to read, you can always click on it and have it open in a separate tab. So if I were to change my report in the editor here, if I were to remove, for example, a visualization, resources has been removed here. It's still shown here, but as soon as I update the page, the change will be reflected. So this is really useful if you are the type of user who needs to create a lot of different types of reports that look different and you want to keep track of the presentation of it all. This is a really neat feature. The way it works in terms of closing a report, so to speak, is that as long as you have the report module open, the report is editable. As soon as you close this tab over here, the report would be locked to this link in the state that you leave it. So that's how that works. Let's input some data so I can show you some of the new result visualizations. I'll just pick some of the ones that I think would be relevant for you to get some insight into. In this case, I've gathered some fictive data. We're going with a case of a group of managers that we wanted to measure at one point and then benchmark them after a while to test if they have made any progress. So I've created a group for these managers and I've gathered their data in the spring to start with. So we'll just have a look at how that looks on a baseline report, and I'll keep it really simple because the visualizations are key here. So the main visualization is still the wheel. Nothing has changed in that regard. It works similarly with clicking into the wheel and seeing the different details on the description of the score, taxonomy-wise, the group distribution, user scores, aspects, and so on. Some of the new report visualizations we've included are top 3 and recommendation. Top 3 are the top 3 competences, like the name says, for a user or for a group. And conversely, we have recommendations, which are the 3 competences with the lowest score for a user or a group. What's really neat about recommendation and top 3 is that it provides the user or the manager administering data with a shortcut to seeing where strengths and weaknesses are and where it would make sense to put in extra effort in their work towards improvement. We've also introduced normal range, which is a way to sort of see how your scores on different competences are spread out from the average. Normal range denotes just including the 95% of the respondents that are the closest to the average and seeing how they're spread out. And what this does is it helps to tell you how much emphasis it makes sense to put on the average score. For example, in this case, we have quite a wide normal range on automation, ranging from 27 to 48%. So the scores range far from the average. It's not like all users are gathered around the average score. Whereas on the other hand, we have something like active participation, which has quite a bit of a narrower normal range, meaning that the average would be a bit more telling for the actual level of the group. So this is how you could use the normal range to tell you something about the averages. Lastly, in terms of new additions, we've updated our pivot table. So the way a pivot table would usually work is that you select some sort of background variable that you want to cross-analyze with some more substantial variable. I'll just pick gender here and select one of the competences. And what's new about this in terms to how it was before is that we've now included the number of respondents in each category, which is denoted by the N. And we've also included a summarization of the results. So this makes it quite a bit more intuitive to read than it was before, and hopefully it will encourage more users to use it. The rest of the visualizations are familiar from the previous version, but a couple of them have gotten visual overhauls, so they're a bit nicer to look at and a bit more intuitive to read. So now that I've shown you how to create a baseline report with the new report module, let's move on to benchmarking. And the way you start creating a benchmark report is simply by adding a new dataset, because that is in all its simplicity what a benchmark report is. It is the comparison of different datasets. And you can see that as soon as I clicked the add new dataset, some new visualizations popped up in the preview, and the changes reflected in the components that you can select for the analysis, because now it has to be geared towards comparison. Right now on the preview, I can see that there are different data sets, but they're a bit hard to distinguish from each other. But luckily, we've inserted tools for that. So let's work with the case I introduced earlier. We have a management group in the spring. This is the first data set we wanna include in the comparison. So I'll just call it spring results, and I'll give it a color. Now coloring happens with just regular RBG codes, so you can input any code you'd like. And then your data set has a specific color, which makes it quite a bit easier to distinguish from the other data that you've included. And down here, I'll then select the results from the fall to see if any progress has been made. And I'll also call this fall results. Let's take a look at what a comparison report looks like then. As you can see, the visualization has changed a bit from how it was before. Before, the wheel was still the primary visualization, but we experienced that some users had a bit of a hard time reading the small white dots that were in the wheel before, so now we've tried to make it a bit more clean cut. The first page in your comparison report will be the direct comparison between the groups on their total competence level score, so summarizing all of the competence scores and taking the average. In this case, the management group we measured in the spring were digital beginners, and in the fall they've now become digital bachelors, so progress has been made. This is just a simple basic comparison of the total score, but the main visualization instead of the wheel is now the competence overview. As you can see, the competence overview lists all of the competences and compares the two group scores against each other. If you want to see more details, you can click on more details or just click on the bars over here, just like you would with the original wheel. And what you get is then a detailed description where the color coding is consistent of the comparison, so you can easily see the differences between the data and how progress has been made. You'll notice that we've also introduced an average, and this average is the average of the data that you've included in your comparison. This means that sometimes the average will make a lot of sense to put emphasis on, while in other cases it won't so much. If you, for example, compare a really small group with a large group, it doesn't tell us much because the small group weighs just as heavily as the large group. So you have to be a bit mindful of what kind of emphasis you put on the average. Just like with the competence overview, there's a question overview where each group has been directly compared to each other on the basis of all the different questions. And if I click into the question, I get a detailed overview of the score and of the response distribution. One of the main demands we wanted to meet with this new update was the possibility to include reporting on specific users, and this is now available. So you can select individual users to do your analysis on, both in a baseline and a benchmark report. And the really cool thing about this is you could essentially create data sets where you compare the same individual over time, but also benchmark an individual against a team, for example. And if you're wondering how you differentiate between specific users if you have one user over time who has the same name, do not fret. We've inputted timestamps on all responses and a group connection, so you can always identify the response that you need. So in this case, all the responses are named something different, but For example, if you wanted to compare respondent 12 in the fall against respondent 12 the next spring, you'd be able to see when the mapping was made and in which group it fell. So it should be fairly easy to identify. In terms of how many data sets you can compare, it's infinite in principle, but be aware that the more data you include, the more messy the report can also become. So think about the purpose of your reporting at all times. But this is also one of the really significant changes from the previous reporting, because before you could only compare one group against another. You could only do one comparison at a time, and this lets you do multiple comparisons across both teams and individuals, and you could even summarize on organizational level. So this is where we feel at least that the new report module really comes to its right. The last new feature that we have in the report module is that the MapUs team can set up a standard report view. And what this means is that if you are the type of organization who does a lot of the same reports and know that there are certain visualizations you almost always include, we can set it up so that every time you enter the advanced report module, it's set to have a given number of visualizations here that you've selected. We can set this up on the analysis components, so the visualizations and individual competence and question sites. We can configure that for you. So if that's interesting to you, please contact us and we'll set it up for you like that. And you can also do it for the benchmark report. And with that, this short presentation of the new version of MapUs rounds off. We're really excited about this update, and we hope you'll be too when you start playing around with it and exploring the new possibilities of mapping your digital competences in a meaningful way.